I wish to thank the organizing committee for giving me the chance to address you today. Due to mitigating personal circumstances, this is still a paper in the making. Your indulgence and feedback will be highly appreciated. Now, there's some change, a modification, let's say, in the title. Druze in the historical writings of Bilad al-Sham, early Ottoman period. This is not working. Is this okay? Is this better? All right. In this paper, I will review a cross-section of historians of Bilad al-Sham in the early Ottoman period, focusing mainly on biographical dictionaries and chronicles that mention the Druze in any context. I will briefly refer to the Christian parallel negative about the Druze of Mount Lebanon. Islam, the dominant faith in Syria in the Ottoman period, had its exclusive social institutions within which Muslims could lead their lives without interacting with other faiths. Social distinctions arose primarily from the law of the land, which imposed on religious minorities certain disadvantages, keeping them in a subordinate position. With such a restrictive backdrop, communities took to documenting their own histories, creating a deficiency in comparative historical material. Chronicling Druze activities was not among the priorities of Muslim historians, which might explain the near absence of historic documentation on the Druze amidst the plethora of Ottoman sources on Islam. Political preponderance of the Druze in a peripheral region like Mount Lebanon was of no value to Muslim historians of Bilad al-Sham. Christian historians, on the other hand, had vested interest in documenting the history of Mount Lebanon. They recognized the Druze-Maronite Accord was a pillar to Lebanese autonomy under the Ottomans. The Entente would, however, come to an abrupt end with the Civil War of 1860. Christian perspective and narrative became markedly different. What do I do here? Okay, these are the names of the biographical dictionaries, and there's another one. Which one? This one? What do you do? Yeah, please do. And there's a continuation. These are not the only ones. There's another page. Yes. Yeah. Okay. In selecting the texts to be reviewed in this paper, I was guided primarily by the understanding of what history meant to or was defined by historians of these centuries. It seemed to me, after reflecting upon these definitions, biography interpenetrated history to the point where terms like tarajim and siyar became anonymous with tarikh. History became the register of notable inhabitants, al-a'yan, of a city or a province or an era. A tribute to those virtuous ancestors became the motive for this genre. Religious scholars, al-ulama, prevailed numerically in biographical dictionaries. In the exclusive Ottoman system of government, they were the only stable element in society whose lives merited documentation and provided, in fact, the history of the Ummah itself. Having set high standards and criteria for inclusion, it becomes clear why no Druze persona is found in those dictionaries, regardless of their prominence in their own locality. Recognized as the heterodox faith, none of their religious scholars would be worthy of inclusion. As a pillar of social order, the Ottomans demanded a domain of obedience in matters religious, public, and private, and religious affiliation of the inhabitants was inscribed within a discourse of loyalty. The most serious rebellion documented in Syria was the one led by the Kurdish Ali Jambulad in collaboration with Fakhruddin ibn Ma'an of the Shuf of Lebanon. Damascus was laid under siege, and their joint forces created havoc in surrounding areas. Al-Hassan al-Burini was quick to label these rebels Khawarij, not only in matters of political, but in matters of religion as well, and readily denounced the defiant Fakhruddin, al-Durzi, al-Shaqi, al-La'in, as if one of them is not enough, right? Al-Durzi, al-Shaqi, al-La'in. Al-Durzi clearly to underscore his apostasy. Burini accused both leaders of trying to establish independent sovereign states. He comments, and I quote, Ibn Ma'an extended his authority where no emir had ever ventured. He exercised unchallenged autonomy in the region. On another occasion, he writes, and I quote, Ibn Jambulad was about to proclaim independence from the Sultanate. قد قرب أن يملك البلاد بالاستقلال. Now, the rebels might have entertained autonomous tendencies, but the word bil istiqlal is an overstated expression, in my opinion. Clearly, the author wanted to accentuate their perfidy. Civil disturbances and rebellions were very frequent in Bilad al-Sham, in Damascus and other major cities, and annals are filled with atrocities committed by Ottoman officials and military. However, the difference in terminology is apparent between Sunni rebels on the one hand and hasharat, vermin, pests of Fakhruddin on the other. The obedient Sunni Saifa, for example, were staunch in support of the Hanafi faith, luminous as gold, in clear contrast to those at-Tughat, al-Bughat, the menacing, decadent tyrants. Moreover, successful campaigns against the Shuf region were designated as Fath, an expression normally preserved for conquest against the infidels. Burini was not attempting an analysis of the change of causation in this context. He was establishing the depravity of the rebels, hordes of darkness, asakir al-dhulma, and the triumph of the troops of Islam. To him, defying the Sultan is defying God. Muhibbi was more accommodating than most of his colleagues. An entry in his dictionary was devoted to Amir Fakhruddin. His treachery notwithstanding, Muhibbi quoted verse in praise of this rebel and presumed heretic. He admired and commended Mulhim, the nephew of Fakhruddin, and his son Ahmad for their total allegiance, al-inqiyad at-tam, to the Sultanate, deliberately avoiding any reference to their religious affiliations. Tariq Abdul Qadir al-Sawaf remains as the most informative about the insurrection of Ali ibn Jambulad and Fakhruddin. Can we turn to the second page, please? However, he failed to offer a penetrating analysis of these events. Instead, accusing the emir of sodomy and drunkenness was to him compelling reason for the Ottoman authorities to undertake such a costly campaign. Actually, there was skepticism within the Damascene community as to the real motivation behind this punitive expedition. Abdul Qadir ascertains that Sultan Murad was penalizing the emir for his, again I quote, his scandalous behavior. In support of his view, Abdul Qadir formulates a conversation between the Sultan and Fakhruddin. In this allegorical exchange, Fakhruddin reveals to the Sultan the treachery of his agents, and I quote, their lust for wealth compromised the Sultanate and allowed me a free hand fil bilad wal ibad, in the region and its people. The latter conversation is rife with cynical undertones. Submissive and politically undermined by the Ottomans, the author shied away from any direct confrontation with them. It would not be pure conjecture to consider that he conveniently uses the rebel as a medium to deliver a message he was certain will provoke the fury and vengeance of corrupt Damascene officials. Finally, there was those biographers who were not interested in politics. Rather, they directly attacked Druze faith. Al-Urdi and Al-Husayni accused them of sacrilege and heresy, uphold what they read in their sacred books. Urdi comments, and I quote, God save us. They are full of blasphemy and polytheism, words that can only be uttered by those indisputably without reason. God be praised, we are the true believers. In other words, we are al-jawahir wal-durar wa ma'adin al-dhahab, as the titles of their dictionaries suggest. It's chronicles. There is a long list of chronicles compiled in this period. I will focus only on two that mention Druze, whether in a religious or political context. Ahmad al-Qaramani, Athar al-Duwal wa Akhbar al-Uwal, A Universal History, and Tarikh al-Amir Fakhr al-Din by Ahmad al-Khalidi al-Safari. In Akhbar al-Duwal, al-Qaramani challenges the very legitimacy of the Fatimids' right to rule. As Shia, they are dawla or kingdom, not a caliphate. He strongly castigates al-Hakim bi Amrillah, the most venerated imam among the Druze and founder of their faith. Al-Qaramani's partiality can be mitigated by the fact that he was witness to the siege of Damascus by Fakhr al-Din. With the collective memory still highly charged, he writes, and I quote, "Until this day, there is a large community in Wadi Taim who call themselves Druze. They believe in the reincarnation of Al-Hakim and await his return. These are all false hallucinations. God protect us from Satan." One is tempted to speculate at invoking the name of Satan in this context. Was Qaramani just using the expression "A'udhu billah" or "Allah najina min ash-shaytan," or could he be insinuating that Satan is the epitome of the Druze community? Well, I leave it up to you. Ahmad al-Khalidi al-Safadi, a Hanafi mufti and deputy judge, was commissioned by Fakhr al-Din to write this tarikh as an apology or justification for certain acts committed or thought to have been committed by the emir against the Ottoman Sultanate. The emir probably bestowed upon him such marks of his favor and munificence as to elicit from the author an enthusiastic, panegyric devoid of reproach or any reference to creed. Curiously, in the biographies of Al-Khalidi that I had the chance to review, there is no mention of this tarikh among his works. As a member of the ulama, it was probably not to his credit to endorse a rebel and a heretic. Christian historians. Tarikh al-Azbina by the Maronite Patriarch Stefan al-Duwayhi is the only work that fits within the scope of this paper. A totally different Fakhr al-Din materializes in Duwayhi. He is the tolerant emir, and Christians lived in peace, built churches, and thrived under his hegemony. Two punitive expeditions against the Shuf were completely ignored by Duwayhi to give the impression of a peaceful and tranquil rule during the Ottoman supremacy. Likewise, the siege of Damascus by Fakhr al-Din and his partisans was briefly reported. Duwayhi's version of that whole episode was intentionally brief to avoid incriminating the emir, among other things. We don't have the time for them now. Now, Christian historians of the 18th and 19th century fall outside the perimeter of this paper. Nonetheless, I will mention a few, if only by name, because they offer an impartial history of the Druze without value judgment or reference to sectarianism. Works like طنوس الشدياق أخبار الأعيان في جبل لبنان، خطار العنتوريني مختصر تاريخ جبل لبنان، حنانية المنير، الدر المرصوف في حوادث الشوف, attest to a liberal and mutually tolerant atmosphere that prevailed between the mixed communities of Mount Lebanon. However, after the turbulence of 1840 and the Civil War of 1860, a significant change in the attitude of Christian historians becomes apparent. Civil war pitted neighbor against neighbor and forced a sense of communal segregation on a society that up till then had thrived on everyday contact and mixture. Abakarius, in his introduction to Nawadir al-Zaman, stated that the sole purpose of his book was to articulate the injustice that befell the victimized Christians of Mount Lebanon. He blames the Druze for propagating the disturbances and eventual massacres. And I quote, "Alas, what infliction befell the Christians from the nation of the Druze." The headings in the book reflect the deep resentment which Christian historians began to exhibit: acts of injustice, treachery, forced immigration, endless heartless massacres, to cite a few. Well, curiously, Abakarius was the only one to speak of an ingrained animosity between the communities. He was enthusiastic about the Egyptian occupation of Lebanon and the respite Ibrahim Pasha gave the the Christian community. Christian collaboration with the Pasha to end the Druze rebellion of 1838 against the Egyptian added to what he called the bad feeling of old that existed between them and the Maronites. Mikhail Mashaka, on the other hand, saw a different approach altogether, and he writes, Christian-Druze relations was really affected by the confiscation of Druze weapons. It was to them worse than death and would later precipitate in the violence that engulfed Mount Lebanon. Shaheen Makarios takes the argument to a different level and reports the joint effort of Druze and Maronites against the Egyptians. I quote, "They shared an independent spirit and both fought with equal tenacity and resolve." These historians failed to note that Egyptian occupation changed beyond repair traditional rule in the mountain, displacing traditional muqata'jis, their inherited privileges thwarted, authority over tenants weakened, disrupted the delicate balance between the various communities, adding to confessional antagonism. In conclusion, I reiterate what I started with, that on the whole, Muslim historiography was neither concerned with the Druze community nor the Druze faith. Druze military successes were mere desperate revolts within the parameter of the Sultanate that established their reputation as rebels, nothing more. Historians of Bilad al-Sham of that era were devout Muslims, and the region was never thought of as a separate politico-cultural entity, but part of the Islamic Ummah. That would explain the writer's fervent renunciation of any political disparity or religious discord. Diversity and pluralism were unequivocally shelved when the bond of allegiance to the state was broken. Historians would not hesitate to unleash an arsenal of sardonic adjectives upon the rebels, their faith put to question and accusations of heresy showered upon them. The presumption of a violence devoid of social cultural meaning is naive. While biographical dictionaries oscillated between inclusiveness and exclusivity, in either case, non-Muslims remain marginal if mentioned at all. As a point of fact, only Muslim ayan, scholars or ulama were deserving of acknowledgement. As for Christian historians, they shared with the Druze their status as minorities in the Ottoman state, which might explain their more indulgent accounts, especially in matters of the faith. True, there was plenty of evident animosity that transpired in the reports of Christian historians, but there was never any reference to religion or criticism of tenets. The confrontations were merely and exclusively geopolitical struggles between two communities, which has always assumed inert, unchanging sectarian identities. The last one, please. I still have. There's still some more. It remains to be said that the Druze have long been part of other people's history. There is no historic reasoning behind the scarcity of material composed by the Druze. Whatever interpretations one might bring up is in the pure conjecture. The cloak of secrecy, which has always veiled their beliefs, made it clearly impossible for their historians to methodically articulate the existence, condition, and vision of their people. Hence, the location, analysis, and ultimately publication of historical Druze sources is required and should be sought after. One case in point is the reluctance to publish up till now the work of Muhammad Malik al-Ashrafani. عمدة العارفين في قصص النبيين والأمم السالفين, despite the richness of its content. Albeit widely quoted by Druze scholars, this work is virtually unknown to others. The value of عمدة العارفين lies in preserving biographies of prominent men who contributed to the propagation and defense of the truth faith. Ashrafani looked beyond factual narrative to an appreciation of the nuance of Tawheed. Two earlier works, Salih ibn Yahya, Akhbar al-Salaf, and Sidq al-Akhbar by Hamza ibn Sbat, are limited in their scope. Salih's targeted audience was his own family. Ibn Sbat included the acclaimed Tarukh dynasty in the margins of his two volumes, which raises two questions. Was it keeping a low profile to avoid riling the Sunni ruling elite? Or more importantly, did Ibn Sbat believe that the Druze were parallel to the mainstream Islam but never part of it? With the scarcity of primary historical compositions, Druze history will remain misinterpreted and misrepresented by ignorant, vengeful, or blundering historians. Thank you. Now, okay, thank you. We're at the end. We've reached the end.
Thanks, wonder lecturer, for.
Blundering, he said.
I know, I like
Yeah, Sulaiman Ahmedi. Thanks for the lecturer. I have a question in this content as well to Professor Akari. He talked about al-rahma wa tasamuh fil Islam and the preservation and dignity of the Druze. My question goes back to the 400 years that the Druze were under the Turkish Empire. Is there any Turkish scholar, anyone who did any review, what we call it دراسة نقدية والاعتذار من الأقليات التي كانت تعيش تحت السلطنة العثمانية, مش not only the Druze, you have the Alawi, the Shia, the Druze, the Berber, the Kurdish, and many others. Is there such a study or such a regret analysis done in the Turkish after Ataturk? I know, I understand. I think Dr. mentioned something about this. And Mr. Abu Ziki, he said about the, what we call the verbal information, history. We know that our grandfather used to say for 300 years, كانوا يناموا البارودة تحت المخدة, something like that. يعني as a Druze, the minority in the Middle East, we were under atrocity and severe punishment every now and then by the Turkish Empire. My question is, to whoever can answer, is there such a revision to the Druze and a regret of what happened? Thank you.
Wait. Please, you already asked.
My question relates to what you said now and what we heard earlier, and that is the Druze loyalty historically has been, from the research we've heard earlier, and I'd like to know from your own research what your perspective is on it, has been to their family, to their Zaimon, and to their land, as opposed to the nation. Now, a land becomes your nation. However, I'd like to know if you agree with that, which is what we heard earlier, and where do you think the Druze in general are today in terms of loyalty?
Well, to start with, one more question.
Thank you, Professor Naila. My name is Fikri Çek. Now I'm writing my thesis on Man family.
I heard you yesterday.
Yeah, I have a question. There are some parallels with 17th century Ottoman official historians, and with your topics. You know, like that's why I said his Fahrettin's sons try to challenge these his familial legacy, and try to challenge in a history by writing an history book and giving his oral testament. My question is, to what extent and these the history books or the biographical sources are in their dialogue in the official mainstream historical discourses, you know, like in Istanbul particularly. And my second question, how can you contextualize these sources? Because if you contextualize in 18th century Christian sources with 16th, 17th century Ottoman sources, I think this is a very different environment. And the Fahrettin's and what is the harshest criticism to the Fahrettin was written under the Celali rebels' time. It was a very terrific time for the Ottomans and for the region itself. And how would you contextualize these guys, like the historians and the time, because like two different time and schedules? Thank you so much.
Answer this, and we'll answer these, and we'll take 2 more questions before we conclude. Tfaddali.
To start with, I mean, with the gentleman who asked me here, I have no idea what Dr. Salim he said before me. I really have no idea what he said before, so I can't answer for him.
I have to address that question. Jamal is here. He could do a better job. But first, I took the floor to demolish this word of Turk you keep using. Turk meant different things in different times. And those Ottomans butchered in 2 years 40,000 Turks, real Turks. And on and off, they butchered Turks as well. But we have to look at history differently. That's one point. The other point, indeed, like the trends in history, we encourage the writing of the history of provinces, of lower classes, of what you call minorities, who were majorities, sometimes in their own environment. We tried to understand the sociology, the economy, and the cultural environment with its ups and downs in the Ottoman Empire. That's what historians should do, I presume. But if it comes to butchering, don't worry, they butchered more Etrog than they did Druze.
Thank you. Yes, now the question was about the loyalty of the Druze and the nation and so on. Now the word, the ideology of nationalism did not exist before the 19th century. So we cannot talk about the nation of the Druze, the nationalism of the Druze, or their loyalty to their country, or it didn't exist at the time. Family, of course, family comes first. And then the Za'im was their protector, so of course it will be to the Za'im or their own locality. But nationalism, I think, is way too early to talk about anything called nationalism. So I don't think the...
It wasn't so much nationalism. The question precisely is land, how Za'im.
Come on, the land belonged to the Za'im. The land belonged mostly to the Za'ami at the time. So the Za'im was really, it was not the land owner, but at least he was the land protector, the land, how shall I say, come on, what am I going to say here? No, not Arab. It's difficult really to just to connect between what happened then to what's happening now. It's a totally different thing. I really don't agree that you can just juxtapose things from the old over what we're having today. No, it doesn't happen. Especially before the civil wars.
Please,
and my period is before the civil wars. And then I will continue the same thing. I just put the Christian historians because there's nothing except Dwayhi. Ibn al-Khila'i, who was an early Maronite, doesn't talk anything about the Druze. So that's why I talked about him. And parallel between the connection between historians of Bilad al-Sham and historians of Turkey. I'm sure there were a lot of Turkish personalities included in these. So there was a lot of connection. And if you just, I don't know if you paid attention, I talked about the rebellion. So if they were fine, nobody talked about them. Nobody even cared. And once the rebellion was over, everything went back to normal. Everybody took their position. So it's just the rebellion. And maybe the same biographer would someone else talk very positively about the same man. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's time for our coffee break. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Provence. Thank you. Sorry. We have to keep on schedule. This is not a debate. This is a Q&A. So we have a coffee break, and then we will go back to our panel. We will start 5 o'clock sharp, because at 6:30 we have to open our exhibit. Kindly, 4. The panel will start at 4 sharp. We have a short coffee break, then we will start at 4. من فضلكم بدنا نبلش إذا بتعملوا معروف. Everyone take their seat. We are starting shortly. من فضلكم إذا بتعملوا معروف. We will start in less than a minute. Have a seat. Kindly have a seat. We are starting. من فضلكم بدنا نبلش. Don't put water bottles because the camera, they look weird. So put them on. Yeah, they look weird. If you may, kindly take your seat. Kindly, we are starting. Dear Hani, you can start, please.
All right. Good evening, afternoon, soon to be evening. So, from a discursive journey, that has visited the Druze in the previous panels, locally and internationally, through war and peace in their institutions and in their history, we now arrive at our penultimate panel of this very rich two-day event celebrating 1,000 years of diversity. Music, theater, and architecture. In other words, sound, sight, audiovisuals, and the space that makes it all possible. From a classical perspective, art and architecture were in their own way modes of celebration of life, both profane and divine. They celebrated cosmic order and nomos, in as much as they celebrated, and equally, both the tragedy and the comedy of our human reality. The very word music still immortalizes the Greek muses of inspiration. The term architecture remains in its etymology a celebration of chief builders and indeed weavers. And the word terjami? Sorry. I'll run my own subtitles. The term architecture remains in its etymology a celebration of chief builders and weavers, and the word theater remains, again from its etymology, a place of viewing, of beholding the unfolding of events, and unveiling of what may lie behind the mask, what may lie behind the veil of Isis. Of course, we have traversed and come a long journey since those etymologies and their roots and origins, and perhaps we have landed on new stages of art and music where we speak of art for art's sake. We speak of politically engaged art, and we speak of art as a social construct as much as it may be a social engineer. How does a society and culture speak and chant through its art? And how may it reflect itself in its space and architecture? And equally, the other side of the questions also raises itself. How does architecture shape its surrounding existence, both internally and externally? And how does music and theater equally shape the story in as much as it may tell it? Sound, music, and architecture. We launch into our penultimate panel. The format will be as follows. I will introduce our first speaker and then give the floor, 20 minutes per speaker, and then the second and the third, and then we will open up the floor for questions and answers. Our first speaker for this panel is Dr. Kathleen Hood, who received her PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of California, Los Angeles, specializing in the music of the Near East. Her publications include Music and Memory in a Global Age, Wedding Songs of the Syrian Druze, published in 2002, and Music in Druze Life, Ritual, Values, and Performance Practice, published in 2007. Her recent research examines the music of Jordanian Bedouins. She is also a professional cellist, performing both Western classical and Arabic music. Currently, she is the publications director and the events coordinator of the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, Department of Ethnomusicology. Her presentation here today is entitled The Jawfiyya, Linking the Past and the Present. Dr. Hood, the floor is yours. Welcome.
I would like to thank the organizers of this event and all the people who have so graciously offered their hospitality. Also to the translators, I'm skipping a couple of sections, so you may want to, you'll probably notice. The Jawfiyya, wait. The Jawfiyya, linking the past and the present. The Syrian Druze in Jebel al-Arab, Suwaida province have a rich musical heritage that includes a variety of musical traditions, including Bedouin and other Arab folk music and dance genres. In the village environment, the main context for traditional music expression are weddings and funerals. Weddings take place over a period of 2 to 3 days, thus allowing many opportunities for a wide variety of musical genres, most of which are accompanied by dances. Change is inevitable, though, and due to Western influence from radio and satellite TV, there is a growing trend in Syrian Druze villages to play stereo. That's the word they use, stereo. Commercial recordings of popular Arab music at weddings. There are indications that this music is slowly and subtly replacing or altering older traditional forms. At the same time, folkloric groups and players of the rababa, a one-string bowed fiddle, are actively engaged in preservation of their folk heritage. Finally, a third trend exists that combines urban and traditional elements and transforms them into something new. Nevertheless, the Jawfiyya, which is a men's accompanied song and dance, has been able to withstand these changes and is as vital as it ever was. It is still performed at weddings and other occasions, including funerals. Indeed, it is the preferred men's song genre at Druze funerals, where the deceased was considered a hero or died in battle, as can be seen in various YouTube videos of funerals of Druze soldiers killed in the Syrian uprising that began in 2011, and in the funerals following the bombing by the self-styled Islamic State in Suwaida this past July. In this paper, which is based on ethnographic research, I argue that the Jawfiyya, because it symbolizes Syrian Druze identity, has the ability to transcend time and remain relevant in the present. Weddings and funerals are the loci for the intersection of Druze performative culture, society, and religion, and are thus the most important context. I note here that the Druze in Jordan share most of the same traditions with the Druze in Syria, since the Druze community in Jordan began with settlers from the Jebel al-Arab, Syria. And the Druze in Lebanon and Palestine/Israel have a different music and dance traditions and have adopted the prevailing musical style and genres of their respective areas. Okay, that was the slide for what I just said. Okay, okay. So yeah, one more, yeah, okay. The most important traditional men's genre is the Jawfiyya, plural Jawfiyat. Originally a war song and dance with two lines of men facing each other, simulating battle, it is unaccompanied and performed by two groups of men singing the lyrics alternately in an antiphonal fashion. The Jofia has various melodies in a number of different meters to which lyrics are set. And the lyrics can also be set to a variety of different Jofia melodies, so they're sort of interchangeable, the lyrics and the melodies. You might hear one set of lyrics with two different melodies, for example. And the lyrics are taken from pre-composed poems, qasida, that can be recited or sung and often describe heroic deeds from the past, many of them describing events of the 1925 Druze revolt against the French. Thus, the lyrics serve to reinforce a collective memory of historical events while inculcating Druze cultural and religious values, such as generosity, courage, ethics, tolerance, chivalry, truthfulness, and spontaneous readiness to help others. One man I interviewed in Sweden stated he did not learn about the Druze contribution to history from books, but from the folk songs, especially the Jofiat. Let me play, this is one of the Jofia. Oh, shoot, how did it go back? Okay, sorry. I played it in the break, actually. I was gonna, okay. How many of you have heard this kind of, oh, all right, okay, yeah. So, okay, he knows it. Oh, that's why he's, yeah, okay, you know that one. All right, good, okay. Okay. The Jofia is the war song par excellence because of its fast driving rhythm and its power to inflame the emotions, allowing men to succeed in battle. Daniel Schachter, in his research on memory, has found that information that is emotionally charged is more likely to be remembered than information without emotional content. In addition to the emotional content, because the Jofiat are sung, the material in song lyrics is easier to remember. And Henry Roediger III, who is a professor of psychology at the Memory Lab at Washington University in St. Louis, has written about how music makes information easy to remember and retrieve later. The structure of the music, including rhythm and rhyme, aids in the recall of the material. Music, lyrics, and emotion all combine in the Jofia, making it an excellent medium for the transmittal of collective memory and values from one generation to the next. Therefore, the Jofia is the prime vehicle for the transfer of Druze values and collective memory to successive generations is the most important of all the song genres in Syrian and Jordanian Druze society. Although it is commonly performed at weddings, the Jofia is also performed at funerals, especially if the deceased was a young unmarried man or a heroic figure, or one who had died in battle. And in the case of this video, he had died in the Syrian uprising.
صح الجبل صح الجبل بني معروف ويا هلي ها عزوتي شربت الدم الحمر أهل الكرامي من الدور الأول حماة الوطن تشهد لكم كل البشر وربوعي هلنا من فروع مسلسلي وربوعي هلنا من فروع مسلسلي.
This isn't the Jofia yet. This is a prelude. Now the men, they're singing Jofia in this clip. Okay, it continues. It's rather repetitive, and okay. There are also a variety of women's song genres and dances that are performed at weddings, but for the purposes of this paper, I will be speaking about the men's genre, Jofia. At the dawn of the new Druze millennium in Syria, 3 trends can be seen. The first trend incorporates Western pop and cultural traditions and looks forward to the future. The second trend is the conscious preservation of the traditional music. It can be seen as a reaction to the first trend and therefore looks backward. Also included in this looking to the past is the use of the Jofia for protest songs and as markers of Druze identity in modern weddings and funerals. The third trend combines traditional and modern and urban and rural elements. Trends imply change, and musical change is inevitable and can come about as the result of contact between cultures as well as from within the culture itself. Ethnomusicologists Bruno Nettle and Margaret Kartomi have delineated some possible responses to cultural contact, including the loss of musical genres or abandonment of components of a musical genre, the consolidation of elements to form a nationally recognized music from a number of once distinct traditions, and a variety of other possible changes to the music. The first trend includes the playing of commercial audio cassettes of popular Arab music at weddings in Druze villages in the Jebel al-Arab. Very often there is a professional disc jockey who brings a sound system and oversees the choice of musical selections. And the residents of the Jebel refer to this process as stereo. This trend is part of a larger global trend toward a westernized universal pop aesthetic, as Simon Frith has called it, and can be considered to represent another culture coming in contact with traditional Druze culture. Although popular music on cassettes has been available for many years in Syria, its appearance in village weddings in the latter part of the 20th century is often linked to exposure to Western culture through the medium of satellite television, which brings the global village and MTV-like videos into almost every home in the villages in Syria. The second trend is the preservation or nativistic revival response, whereby there is preservation or revival of a traditional genre in response to its perceived threats to its existence in the form of a competing genre. In this case, the competing genre is stereo. The traditional Druze genres are increasingly being preserved via the agency of folkloric groups such as the Firkat Salkhad and Firkat Mellah that perform at weddings and other performances. There are also a number of young rababa players attesting to the preservation theory. Although the Druze may lose some of the traditional genres performed in weddings, they may still keep their identity intact by shifting these genres to the domain of folkloric ensembles as a kind of frozen tradition. Genres important to the identity of a group are also likely to be preserved. As mentioned previously, the Jofia is the Syrian Druze's most important genre, and it is still the men's song genre performed at Druze funerals, as we saw in the other video. In the next video, I show a clip from another YouTube video, and this, okay, that was the one I played, sorry. Okay. I'm jumping ahead of my, and in the next, this is the next slide, we see a YouTube video of a wedding that was posted in August of 2012, and the guests are, this is like a year after the Syrian uprising had begun, and the guests are singing a different Jofia, one that is opposed to the current Syrian regime. It appears that it is a modern wedding in a sala or hotel, and the men are not separated, but dancing Jofia together, and something that would not typically have happened in the older traditional weddings. So there you see the women and men together. Okay. The importance of the Jofia to Syrian Druze identity is demonstrated by the following story. While in Syria conducting my dissertation fieldwork, then President Hafez al-Assad had passed away in June 2000. The government imposed a 40-day period of mourning on the country, which meant no festive weddings. However, I was invited to attend a wedding during this period. Although it was very somber and most of the singing and dancing associated with weddings did not occur, the men still sang Jofiyat during the Zepha. Performance of Jofiyat in this context was most likely acceptable in view of the fact that Jofia are also performed at funerals, but the event also impressed on me the importance of the Jofia to Syrian Druze identity, and that this genre is outside the realm of mere entertainment. As demonstration of the continued importance of the Jofia today, men can be seen singing a Jofia at a mass funeral in Raha, in the village in Sweda province. The funeral is held in July, this past July, for villagers who had been killed in the horrific Islamic State bombings in Sweda. And the lyrics are as follows. My people, the Beni Maruf, are the most courageous. Those from the Jebel al-Arab and the Shuf quickly answered the call of dignity. Go with God's blessing. You, referring to the army of Amir Abdullah Tanuhi, are the symbol of glory. It is the army of Master Abdullah, the Tanuhi prince. I will play this is the funeral where they're singing that song. Oh, oops, back. Let me see. Hold on. I know sorry. I have to. This is an old Jofia using a poem that is apparently without a known author and is considered part of the folklore. One consultant from Sweda told me that he recalls singing it in the fields during harvest time in the 80s, but it is likely much older than that. Although the men in the video did not actually sing the last verse about Amir Abdullah Tanuhi, people would know the lyrics and know the reference nevertheless, pointing up the idea of transmission of history via the Jofiyat. The video is from the Raha Facebook page, and a link will be in the article. The third trend is modernization, a term that Nettle applies to music in which compatible but non-central elements have been adopted. In the case of the Druze of the Jebel al-Arab, modernization is related to urbanization, and ensembles of urban instruments such as synthesizer, violin, oud, kanun, accordion accompany songs that were originally unaccompanied. Sometimes the original arrangements are used, but verses are cut to shorten the songs to perform at festivals. So some of these are, sometimes a Jofia now will appear on YouTube and it will have a drum track or synthesizer accompanying it. In conclusion, in the Syrian Druze culture, as in other cultures, change is inevitable. It is important to keep in mind, however, that change is not something imposed on a culture, but is something the people within the culture choose. Although stereo has supplanted some of the traditional genres in weddings, a contrary trend is occurring toward preservation of those genres that support Syrian Druze identity, and the main one of these being the Jofia. The Jofia is the prime vehicle for the transfer of Druze values and collective memory to successive generations. It is the most important of all the song genres in Syrian and Jordanian Druze society. Its importance is also shown that it is the genre that is performed at both weddings and funerals. In addition to both of those being important life cycle events, weddings and funerals are further connected by the Druze belief in the transmigration of souls, where at the moment of death, a person's soul is immediately reborn in a human body. So weddings and funerals alike celebrate the circularity and continuity of life. The Syrian Druze at the beginning of the new millennium are making changes to their musical traditions that reflect their increasing modernization and incorporation into the global society, while at the same time, by preserving key traditional genres, they are reaffirming their core values and Druze identity. As the genre that most symbolizes Syrian Druze identity, the Jofia has the ability to transcend time, yet remain relevant in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hood, for this very insightful treatment and analysis of Jofia.
Okay.
From stereo and back.
Yeah, right. Are you familiar with Jofia? Yeah.
Not as much as...
Right. Okay. So now we want to change places because we ask questions later, right? Okay.
You go Malik? Yeah, Malik. All right.
Should I change places or
do you need
Are you using PowerPoint?
I'm not using PowerPoint.
All right, then you're fine. Then you can, you can set up. Okay, great.
Get ready.
So, our next speaker will be Malik Najjar, and his talk entitled The Druze in Film and the Theoretical Stage, Representations, Fictions, and Inventions. Malik Najjar is an associate professor of theater arts with the University of Oregon. He holds a PhD in theater and performance studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, a Master of Fine Arts in Directing from York University in Toronto, and a Bachelor of Arts in Theater Arts from the University of New Mexico. He's an associate member of Stage Directors and Choreographers Society, the SDC, an alumnus of the British American Drama Academy, Lincoln Center Directors Lab West, and Rawi Screenwriters Lab in Jordan. He has directed the world premiere of Jamil Khouri's Precious Stones, a staged reading of his own play Talib, and was lead director for Semitic Commonwealth, All with Silk Road Rising in Chicago. He's the editor of 4 Arab American plays, works by Layla Buck, Jamil Khouri, Yusuf Al-Gindi, Lamis Ishaq, and Jacob Qadir, and the selected works of Yusuf Al-Gindi. Sorry, Al-Gindi. I work with Al-Gindi, so that confuses me. It's Jindi. He's also the author of the Arab American Drama, Film and Performance, a Critical Study, published in 1908 to the present. Malik is a member of the Advisory Board for Arab Stages and New Arab American Theater Works. Next year, he will be directing Yusuf Al-Jindi's Pilgrims, Musa, and Sherry in the New World with Minority Voices Theater in Eugene, Oregon, and Hannah Khalil's Scenes from 71 Years with Golden Thread Productions in San Francisco. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Malik Najjar.
Shukran. Thank you so much to Makram, all of the organizers, for letting me come back to our homeland of my great-grandfathers, my mother's family, and my wife's family. So, shukran, and thank you. And I dedicate this paper to all of those who are being held captive in Sueda right now. God bless the Muwahhidun. The Druze, as depicted in plays and films by non-Druze playwrights, screenwriters, directors, fall into 2 distinct categories, namely as a mysterious quasi-religious sect that follow their beliefs literally, or as a strict social group that adheres to tradition dogmatically, yet with little reason behind their fanatical beliefs. There have been surprisingly few representations of the Druze in theater or film, but the few that exist provide a fascinating view of how the Druze are often misportrayed and, more importantly, misunderstood. This paper examines 3 works that focus on Druze characters. Robert Browning's 1843 dramatic poem, The Return of the Druzes, Iran Riklis and Soha Arraf's 2004 film, The Syrian Bride, and the 2016 play, When Farah Cries, or Andama Tabki Farah, by Syrian playwright Mudar al-Haji. What these 3 dramatic film examples demonstrate is that in dramatic representations, the Druze remain an esoteric, mysterious, rigidly cloistered group that tolerates little by way of dissent or social resistance. What is missing, however, is a deeper understanding of the Tawhid faith and how it shapes, guides, and governs the lives of Druze, both the initiate and the uninitiated. Without a fundamental understanding of the Tawhid faith, these representations risk misrepresenting the Druze people. And in a time when this minority is being persecuted, these misrepresentations can be dangerous because they risk portraying the Druze as a heretical sect that's deserving of little empathy or understanding. In his seminal book, Orientalism, Edward Said, Allah yarhamu, writes that when attempting to analyze Orientalist texts, one must place emphasis on the evidence, which is not visible as representations and not as the quote-unquote natural depictions of the Orient. And these representations are found in histories, philologies, political treatises, and artistic texts. He states, quote, "The thing to look at are style, figures of speech, setting, narrative devices, historical and social circumstances, not the correctness of the representation, nor its fidelity to some great original." As he clearly remarks, Orientalists believed that since the Orientals could not represent themselves, it was the duty of the Westerner to represent the Orient for them. And these representations are highly organized and encoded systems which employ many devices to express, indicate, and exchange messages and information of what they represent. What Said calls the represence cannot depend on the Orient, and Orientalism stands forth and away from the Orient, making its sense on the Westerner rather than on the Orient. I relate Said's notion regarding representation in Orientalism to Robert Browning's play, The Return of the Druzes. Browning, who always fancied himself a dramatist, but whose dramatic poems were complex yet nearly unstageable, attempted to portray the Druze society in exile from their Lebanese homeland. According to Browning biographers William Hall Griffin and Harry Christopher Minchin, The Return of the Druzes is based on an idea Browning found in Biographie universelle ancienne et moderne. Browning scholar Joe Phelan states that Browning also turned to C.F. Volney's travels through Syria and Egypt in the years of 1783. And also Alphonse de Lamartine's travel in the East, including a journey to the Holy Land, written in 1832 to 33. All of this is to say that Browning had no first-hand experience of the Druze, and like most Orientalists, relied on second-hand accounts for his information. He clearly had no intention of accurately portraying the Druze, though to his credit, he does insert several names and details that make the play seemingly well-researched. He does mention Hamza, for instance. But by utilizing these texts, Browning has furthered the outward misperceptions of the Druze than to have any serious attempt at accurately conveying the core beliefs of the Tawhid faith. By doing so, he further implicates the Druze as an irrational, bloodthirsty, esoteric sect that doggedly adheres to antiquated notions of patriarchy, religious zealotry, and an unexamined herd mentality. Browning's 5-act play concerns a group of Druze elders, or mashayikh, who are exiled to the islet of the southern Sporades, garrisoned by the Knights Hospitallers of Rhodes. These Druze are accompanied by a Druze man named Jebel, who they believe is the reincarnation of Al-Hakim bi-Imr Allah himself. But this Jebel, who knows he's an imposter, yet perpetuates his deception to inspire his fellow Druze to revolt, promises to liberate the Druze from the Knights and return them to their native homeland of Lebanon. Jebel loves a Druze woman named Anil, who is also loved by Loy de Dru, a knight novice who wishes to take over as the new prefect of the islet where the Druze are exiled. Another Druze initiate named Khalil believes Jebel is God Hakim. Although Jebel is feeling tremendous guilt for lying to his people and his love, Anil rejects Loy's affection, preferring Jebel, who she loves, as a man, not as a divine being. Jebel decides to murder the prefect who is imprisoning him and his people on the island. When he attempts to slay him behind the curtain, he realizes that Anil has killed the prefect herself. Jebel then reveals he is not Hakim, but as Browning calls him, but just another ordinary Druze, something that she is happy to hear, though she insists he confess himself to the other Druze. Jebel then decides not to tell them the truth of his identity, but rather to use the falsehood to inspire his people to revolt and return to the Lebanese homeland. When Jebel finally does confess to his duplicitous nature, Anil, in her excitement and love for his noble soul, inexplicably dies, calling him Hakim. Jebel then stabs himself and tells his Druze brethren on to the mountain, at the mountain Druzes, and also dies. He could have just applied for this conference and come himself, but he didn't. Browning's drama conveys much of the Orientalist notions the British had about the Druze during his lifetime, and his play is rife with inaccuracies and inconsistencies. For instance, instead of being called Al-Hakim, Jebel is called Hakim. The character's name Jebel is actually an antiquated British term for the uninitiated Druze, which of course are called the Juhal. Although Browning does write that the Druze are attired in, quote, the ancient dress of the Druzes, consisting of a distinctive black vest and white turban, he also adds racist descriptions such as their glozing accent, their swarthy looks, and their small Arab thin-lipped silver mouths. Who knows what that means? As far as descriptions of the Druze religion are concerned, the Druze are called a mystic tribe, a simple tribe, and savage wizards. Browning's understanding of the Druze people and faith is confused, to say the least. On the one hand, he seems to grasp the importance of Al-Hakim to the Druze and the importance of the Druze have given to his return and reemergence. However, he also fails to understand what the scriptures say about the return of Al-Aql and the subsequent Day of Judgment, or Yawm al-Din, as the Tawheed faith ascribes to the second coming. As Dr. Anis Abaid states in his book, The Druze and Their Faith in Tawheed, implicit in the disappearance of Al-Hakim, like that of Al-Mahdi, in the 12-ver Shia tradition, is the belief in the triumphal return of the vanished Imam as a redeemer and savior. According to Dr. Sami Nasib Makarim, Allah yarhamu, in his book, The Druze Faith, those muwahhidun who accepted the divine call 1,000 years ago, quote, would be liable for them on the final judgment day, and their lives would be measured against the promises they had made in the contracts. According to Nassim Dana in his book, The Druze in the Middle East, on the Day of Judgment, Al-Hakim would be revealed in a human image and would judge the world by means of the sword, al-sayf, and in a brutal manner, unf. And furthermore, according to Druze historian Dr. Sami Swaid, all of the hudud will return on Judgment Day. On that day, he says, goodness will prevail over evil, justice over injustice, and truth over falsehood. Emancipation from ignorance, jahl, is the essence of the Day of Judgment to the Druze faith. The Druze believe that the day is very near and that what is required of them is to contemplate and meditate that nearness. Therefore, Browning's entire premise for the play Return of the Druzes is predicated upon what a Roman dramatist might call the happy idea that Jebel could possibly deceive his followers into believing he was Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah. In fact, the fact that they can and do believe him lies in his characterization of the Druze in the play as, quote, simple-hearted Druze, unquote, who believe him and who are infantile compared to their European counterparts. According to Phelan Browning, who saw the Druze as by synecdoche, the Arabs are naive, credulous, childlike, and implicitly in need of European leadership and guidance. And according to another Browning scholar, Gal Manor, Browning's early works from the early and middle period imply that, quote, the Orientals are developmentally backward, ruled by passion, and destined for conversion to Christianity, unquote. And as Said notes, Arabs in the Orientalist literature are often characterized by primitivism, occultism, and anchoring in the past. So Manor posits that Browning's Oriental images coincided with the Victorian cultural ideology that Semites were in a state of arrested development. with a culture characterized by primitive magic and superstition. Manner states that in the play, quote, the Druze religion is emptied of meaning and depicted as false and groundless, whereas Christianity is not similarly dissected, unquote. Browning initially wrote to William Macready, the famous actor-manager of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, hoping he would produce his play, which Browning described as rife with drabbing, stabbing, and other pretty tricks. But Macready was decidedly unimpressed, writing in his diary, I read Browning's play, and with the deepest concern, I yield to the belief that he will never write again. To any purpose. I fear his intellect is not quite clear. I do not know how to write back to Browning. So, along with his misgivings about the text, Macready feared that the audience must be acquainted with the Druze before they'd be willing to watch a play about them. And in his response to Macready, Browning wrote that Victorian audiences, quote, know nothing of the Druzes and their doings until I tell them, which is the office I take on myself, as they are men and women oppressed and outraged in such and such way, desirous of being rid of their oppressor and outrager, unquote. Needless to say, Browning's play never made it to the London stage, thank goodness. According to K.P. Sarati, Browning's plays are unactable because he was never able to project the feelings, thoughts, and motives of his characters onto the public stage in a way that a theatrical audience would demand. Browning could not escape from his egocentrism and his constant habit of introspection to create genuine stage characters. And ultimately, The Return of the Druzes is a failed experiment for many reasons. Its overly grandiloquent language, its melodramatic characterizations, and most importantly in our context, its greatly orientalized treatment of the Druze and their faith in Tawheed. Now, director Iran Riklis and screenwriter Suha Arraf, their 2004 film, The Syrian Bride, which takes place in the occupied Golan Heights, offers a more nuanced and humanistic portrayal of Druze life in the 21st century. The film is set in the Golan village of Majd al-Shams during two major events. The blissful event of the marriage of Muna, the young Druze woman in the Golan, betrothed to Talal, her Syrian actor who stars in Musalsalat in Damascus. And he's kind of a comic ghawar figure. And simultaneously, Muna's father, Hamid, who has recently been released from an Israeli prison, who's decided to join his fellow Druze in a march commemorating the death of the former president, Hafiz al-Assad. By doing so, however, he violates the rules of parole, and an Israeli officer warns Hamid to avoid the protests or risk being arrested. The family gathers for the wedding, including Muna's profligate brother Marwan and her older brother Hatim, who returns from self-imposed exile with his Russian doctor wife Elena and their young son. The Druze sheikhs gather at Hamid's home and tell him that if his son Hatim is invited to the wedding, they will not only not attend the wedding, they will cast Hamid out of the Druze circle. The last subplot involves Muna's sister Amal and her husband Amin, married in an arranged manner and who have become estranged over time. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead. The film addresses several issues that are pertinent to the Druze generally, such as endogamy and group affiliation, and the precarious situation the Druze living in the Golan must face being divided from their families in Syria. According to Janan Farj Falah, Yusuf Maman, and Wafa Amasa, since 1967, the social and marital relations between Syrians and those residing in the Golan have decreased significantly. Quote, in the last 30 years, only 130 marriages have taken place among the different Druze villages in the Golan Heights. In most cases of marriage were between Israeli Druze men of the Golan with their Syrian female relatives. The authors also note that endogamy is compulsory in Druze societies. The Druze religion, they say, prohibits polygamy and demands women's full consent to marriage. However, it strictly prohibits its men to marry women from different communities or religions and vice versa. A person who violates this law is banned to be eliminated and outcast from the community. This custom is the result of the elders, the religious leaders, to create greater cohesion among the community members, and thus they had to come to the conclusion that marriage within the clan or community would develop mutual love and caring, an element which was needed in the past to cope with the pressure and persecution of their environment. And so this film, which focuses on the fact that there is endogamy that occurs in the Druze society, in many ways very much is correct. However, by focusing its attention so strictly upon the fact that the Mashaykh are against this marriage, it often gives the dogmatic interpretation that the Druze hold on to these beliefs strictly because they're dogma and they have no real underpinnings in the society itself. And in truth, what the film fails to do is to discuss the idea of endogamy as a unifying force within the Druze community, and that's why it exists. So by portraying Muna's betrothal in this way, it again ascribes the Druze as strictly dogmatic and unchangeable in many ways for no reason. And if you are not familiar with the Druze sect, you would have no idea about why that matters. Furthermore, in the play When Farah Cries, which is written by a Syrian playwright, the character comes from Suwaida, and she has a father who's a doctor in Suwaida. And similarly, she is dating a Sunni man, and the father is not, of course, he is not accepting of this relationship. However, again, without understanding the Druze, it just seems that the father is dogmatically holding on to a belief that might be rigid and cruel rather than one that is based in a religious or social tradition. So all of these things, I believe, further disassociate the Druze from their belief in Tawheed in the eyes of non-Druze people. So I'm just going to wrap up with this last section about how the Tawheed faith is portrayed. The difficulty with these representations of the Druze is that sometimes they're the only ones that exist. And by having so few portrayals of the Druze in theater and film, audiences might believe that these are completely accurate portrayals. Furthermore, the Druze are not a homogeneous community, so more representations of their varied communities throughout the Middle East and the diaspora are needed. The remedy? We need more dimensional dramatizations of the Druze and their faith in Tawheed. One complication is that there are so few Druze working in theater and film. And because of that, we don't have the people who might have the interest in portraying the Druze more dimensionally, the way that other groups have. So I would urge all of you who might have children that are interested in going into the arts or into film to please consider that as a viable option, not only because it's, please do, not only because the arts, I think, are very life-enriching, but also because until we actually take control of the narratives, we are never going to be portrayed realistically, in my opinion. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to not keep waiting for someone else to portray us honestly, but rather, it's incumbent upon us to do so ourselves. So thank you very much. Shukran.
Dr. Najjar, I have a proposition. Yes. Shall we write a play about Browning?
Let's do it.
And the struggles of his intellect. Yes.
Let's write a play about a Druze conference that takes place in 2018.
Absolutely.
Let's do that instead.
And discuss Browning. Fantastic. Thank you so much for this lovely, really eye-opener on, I guess, persisting or Oriental portrayals, right? Persisting. Thank you. Can we keep interjections to the, yes, thank you so much. Thank you. With that, we move on to our third speaker on this panel, Dr. Makram Al-Qadi, who was born in Beirut in 1974. Makram Al-Qadi received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from the American University of Beirut in 1997, and his Masters of Architecture from Parsons School of Design in 1999. After working at the offices of Fumihiko Maki in Japan, he joined Stephen Hall Architects, where for 5 years he was project architect on numerous international projects, among them the World Trade Center proposal with Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, and Charles Gwathmey, and the winning entry to the Natural History Museum of the Los Angeles County competition, as well as the Beirut Marina. He currently teaches design studio here at the American University of Beirut. His talk is titled Playgrounds, the Politics of Religion and the Architectural Typologies. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Makram Al-Qadi.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Rabah for the invitation. As mentioned, I'm a Lebanese architect with an architecture practice that is based both in Beirut and New York. It's called Left, with my partner Ziad Jamaluddin. I will start my talk with a reference to a 1983 movie by Woody Allen called Zelig, in which Allen plays a nondescript character, Dr. Zelig, who has a pathology of adopting the personality of the people surrounding him, in a way reincarnating himself into the adjacent personality. I will show. I think the idea is that when he goes next to a French guy, he adopts a kind of a fake French accent. When he's next to a Chinese guy, he develops Asian traits. So this idea somehow of the mockumentary represents the identity crisis of many minorities in the Middle East. It was seen at the time as a representation of Jewish angst and paranoia, but for minorities in the Middle East, paranoia can potentially be a productive endeavor and undertaking. The silver lining is that this fear of being on the verge of extinction provides an impetus to achieve one's bucket list. It also provides a conceptual clarity beyond overarching hegemonic tendencies that might plague other majorities. The challenge for minorities has historically been the degree to which they either integrate in or segregate from a larger identity, be it national, ethnic, religious, or other. The interesting thing about Lebanon specifically is that, in fact, we are all minorities with varying degrees. In that sense, the word diversity in the title of the symposium can be understood not by defining an us versus an other, which is an external way to look at diversity from without, but by showing that this other that we're talking about is not one dogmatic monolith, but a series of many subdivisions that overlap with us. It is looking at diversity from within that is of interest to our architectural practice, which tries to deconstruct the myth of majority and minority, of homogeneity and of purity, through the practice of architecture and through sometimes the search not only for what unites us, but for what subdivides us further into these overlapping identities. Dr. Zelig, in that sense, becomes a symbol of conformity within a larger whole and an exception to that whole at the same time. The focus for me in this talk is the overlap of religious identities with the space of architecture, and I will be discussing this in parallel with a series of small architectural histories and narratives that I will reflect on, all pertaining to that space where architecture, politics, and religion collide and intersect. Our interest in the religious space of architecture started by looking more attentively at the space it occupies within the city or its geopolitics. The seeming coexistence of mosques and churches in Lebanon beholds a continuous turf war between the different religious institutions. Beirut's city center claims the highest density of religious buildings per square meter in the world, with dozens of churches and mosques and one synagogue recently renovated. Dictated not by a demographic demand for more religious buildings, this density is a symbolic and territorial competition to mark each religion's political presence. One can only read the construction of Al-Amin Mosque, starting in 2002, as a response 30 years later to the Lady of Lebanon Basilica in Harissa, whose design was inspired by both the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange's St. Mary Cathedral in Tokyo, but also his Olympic Stadium, which is a more befitting reference since religion in Lebanon is the country's national sport. The Al-Amin Mosque marked urbanistically, albeit not architecturally, the paradigm shift in Lebanon, in Lebanese politics, from a Christian-dominated political system to one that is still sectarian and confessional in essence, yet predominantly Muslim. In 2010, as yet another response, the biggest illuminated cross in the world was erected in Qanat Bakish. It was supposed to claim the title of the biggest cross in the world, but a cross in Latin America was deemed higher, so the Lebanese decided to reclaim it as the biggest lit cross. If religious identity is not shaped by architecture, it is certainly shaping our architecture. Within this architectural narrative, the Druze religious space, or the Khalwa, is out of the competition from the onset. If we look architecturally at the urban placement of the church versus that of the mosque, we can see that the church has historically been a mid-space object to be looked at from a distance. This is in relationship to a main public space where the crowds can gather after Mass, whereas the mosque had a different relationship that is more integrated with the city fabric, or what we call urban morphology. So it is a relationship that is still architecture, but inwardly so. The khalwa, on the other hand, is not even architecturalized as an object, but interiorized and covert due to the histories of oppression that the Druze have endured. So one cannot speak of a Druze architecture per se, as it can be anywhere. It can be here, it can be here, and it can be anywhere, basically. In relationship to the Christian square and the Islamic courtyard, interiorized courtyard. Few exceptions obviously exist. But the mainstream, this is in Hasbaya, but the mainstream is still an average interior space that is nondescript, like Dr. Zelig, covert and inverted typologically. Part of our work has since been focusing on the architecture of Islam, and I will focus my presentation on the design that we did for the Amir Shakib Arslan, which will come later, but I will present it as a continuity of a research that started in 2011 on the architecture of Islam, and that led to the mosque's design in 2016, and has since sprung out and continued after its construction, which and the research that still preoccupies us today. In terms of Islam as a religion, it's the fastest growing religion in the world with some estimates of a 2.9% growth annually, projected by 2025 to be the biggest religion in the world. In terms of demographics, it's a bottom-heavy religion, meaning that there are way more youth to the religion than, for example, Christianity or Judaism. But in terms of, one would expect that with this bottom-heavy religion, that the amount of experimentation for the youth with architecture of the mosque, of the Islam, which is the mosque, one would see a lot of more experimentation that is happening, specifically, for example, with recent examples such as the previously shown Al Amin Mosque, which derives its shape from early Ottoman, the Blue Mosque, for example, in 1609. Surprisingly, because architecturally there's no specific typology for what a mosque should be. The dome, the minaret are all neither in the Quran nor in the Hadith. So, for example, even the orientation towards Mecca wasn't always the case. Earlier examples of mosques were oriented towards Jerusalem. So none of these typologies that we take for granted are specific to the religion, but kind of are more social construct as the religion developed. The minarets are developments of church bell towers or even synagogue towers. The dome itself is a development on earlier Hagia Sophia, for example, but it was taken by the architect Sinan and developed further to become more buoyant, admitting more light into the space of the mosque. These are recent examples of contemporary mosques that are being built around the world. This is on the Asian part of Istanbul by Erdogan. This is Putin inaugurating the mosque in Moscow, and even the Sheikh Zayed Mosque in Abu Dhabi. That was not always the case. I mean, in the days of Arab nationalism or Pan-Arabism, where the politics of the Arab world were more open-minded and more kind of pushing the envelope politically, it reflected on the architecture of the city itself and the architecture of the mosque. So these are examples of more modern mosques that were built. For example, this is Aisha Bakkar Mosque in Beirut in the 70s by Ja'far Tuqan. This led us to kind of the researching on the translation of the word mosque in Arabic, and you have two options for that translation, either a jamia or a masjid. Obviously, jamia is from the word jama'a, which is a gathering place, versus masjid is more about the prostration, so it's more liturgical in nature. But the idea of the jamia is that the mosque could go beyond the dogmatic religious space, but it could open up to the city programmatically and otherwise. This is the premise of a studio that we gave in 2011 at Yale, where we took the site in Tripoli and we kind of produced a book out of it, reclaiming or redefining what a mosque could be for the 21st century. We called it the expanded mosque because our idea was to think about the mosque in terms of its porous nature and not its kind of sacred dogmatic nature, which kind of relates to the idea of programmatic hybridity to the mosque itself. Students, for example, worked on redefining the typology through the use of water and water activities, through the use of agriculture, through the use of different lights that would come at different prayer times in the day, turning it into a museum for Islamic art, for example. So something that is an architecture of the mosque plus something else. Eventually, we did also, based on an invitation, we did for the Prague Quadrennial in 2011 also. We took at the time what was a ban on Islamic minarets in Switzerland. This is a poster from that campaign. Only 4 were built in Switzerland, and they kind of established the ban for minaret construction afterwards. But we took these 4 minarets and we grafted them onto 1980 Venice Biennale pavilion, which is a floating theater. We grafted these minarets onto the theater. It's a theoretical speculative project, obviously. But the idea was to kind of take this floating mosque and create a map of an imaginary travel that would go from the Middle East. This is a map of the Mediterranean. So this is Italy. It's kind of reversed, so it's hard to read a little bit. But the idea of taking this mosque from the Middle East on a journey towards Europe, kind of playing on the resurgent at the time Islamophobia that was finding foot in Europe. So the idea was to kind of create a degree 0 mosque, which is the simplest mosque that one can have, which is the carpet. And suing it in Turkey, I think, at the time we did it. Anyway, we got a commission in 2015 from MP Walid Jumblat to build a mosque in the village of Mukhtara. Eventually, it got called the Amir Shakib Arslan, but during our design, the name was still in flux. The village of Mukhtara, obviously, there's a palace, the 18th century palace that you see in the picture here. Which is kind of in close proximity to the mosque itself. But the interesting thing about the village itself is that it housed in the 18th century a mosque in Hayy al-Masihiyya now, so it's a different location than the mosque we eventually built. That was built by Bashir, a mosque that was built by Bashir Jumblat and destroyed by Bashir Shahab, based on their kind of feud at the time. But another interesting religious space is the Maronite Church. And there's an interesting story about it because it shows the pluralistic nature of the Druze villages in general that housed many mosques. The idea here was the myth, or I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but this is an interesting story because at one point the Khazin family who were friends with Sheikh Bashir would always come on Saturday night and spend kind of the whole night at the palace, but eventually always having to leave back to their village because they had to attend prayer on Sunday. So the Prince Bashir decided to build a church for them so they can stay over till Sunday. And that shows kind of the non-dogmatic nature of the relationship between the different communities in Mount Lebanon, specifically, I guess, in Lebanon in general. That was much more fluid than it is now. This is the site that we were given at the beginning of the design project. The Zaytuni was an existing tree on one side and a fountain, 18th century fountain on the other side. We started by taking the generic box dome minaret typology and creating an abstraction to the shape of the mosque itself, more of a transparent veil that would go over the existing masonry cross-vaulted space inside. So this is the space of the mosque here. And we added this tectonic veil on top of it. The idea was to take again, this generic box, dome and minaret typology and transforming it and hybridizing it into a modern abstraction of different tectonic elements. All these tectonic elements were created in the direction of Mecca specifically, but none of them form elements that are in the direction of Mecca. So they are all forming concave arcs, portraying the outwardly embracing nature of religion. This is the project as it was built eventually. The idea is that it's a kind of a veil that wraps next to, above, and adjacent to the the stone masonry vaults, creating 3 gates, one at the level of at the scale of the mosque itself, one as an entry to the tomb of Kamal Jumblat, and another entry to the space of the offices and the new plaza we created above. We took out one of the floors that were recently added. The ablution space is kind of a channel from the Barouk River, so we created kind of a contextual project from different angles. These are drawings that we've created. We've added a piazza in front of the mosque where a parking used to sit. And we linked basically this piazza to the historic fountain at the entry of the mosque. a couple of, this is a kind of a drawing that depicts the kind of collapsing of the plan and elevation in the tradition of Islamic representation. I'm going to go a little bit quicker. This is the aerial showing the fountain, the skylight above that brings lights to the inside of the mosque. A couple of quick photos. One of the interesting things that we wanted to address is the idea that Muhammad Arkoun discussed in his book Al-Ansana wal-Islam. Basically that the European Enlightenment project of the 18th century was based on the humanism of Islam. So the idea, the Western idea of mutually exclusiveness between Islam and modernity was challenged in this book. We took that and we created the word insan, which on one hand relates to this idea of humanism of Islam, but also creates kind of a dialectic relationship with God, kind of the human-God relationship that Hegel talks about. But the idea is that also man is in service of God as much as, or maybe to a lesser degree, whatever you want to put it, as God is in service of man also. The idea also, we created kind of a three-dimensional calligraphy. So the word insan here and Allah here are based on a structural manipulation of the tectonic elements. And specifically the word Allah, if you see it from one angle, you see it as a solid. If you see it as from another angle, it disappears, addressing the idea of God as an idea or a concept or an abstracted idea. If you look at it frontally, the mosque becomes also this ethereal, transient presence. On the inside, we collaborated for the carpets. We kind of collaborated with an artist called Lawrence Abu Hamdan to create kind of an ecography of the call to prayer. So this is a call to prayer translated into an imagery. The mihrab itself is at the same time kind of pointing towards the direction of Mecca, which by law, you can vary it, again, 15 degrees off of Mecca, so you can be wrong by 15 degrees. And it again shows kind of the idea that religion is not as dogmatic as we would like it to believe. Or people tend to believe. But the idea, again, is that the mihrab, although it kind of is very monodirectional, through the mirror reflection of it in terms of materiality, it gives us multiple directions off the bat. We worked also with Nisreen Khudr, who's here, on the call to prayer itself, but eventually it wasn't used. The idea, again, was to kind of create a visual relationship between the inside of the mosque and the exterior of the mosque. Once you're inside, you can look out and see the minaret where the sound is coming from. The idea, again, also for the temporary separation of gender. This is something that we were against at the beginning, but Dar al-Fatwa insisted on it, so we abided. Another aspect of the mosque on the inside was drawn from the theologian and anthropologist Yusuf Siddiq, who addresses the word Iqra as the first word of the Quran, Iqra bismi rabbika. And the idea behind this is that had God wanted us to recite blindly the Quran, he would have said recite. But the idea of having said read in the name of your God, reading entails a post-structuralist understanding of the Quran as a text rather than a meta-narrative, and hence prone to interpretation. So we adopted this word as an embossing in the wood at the back of the mosque where usually the reading occurs. This is from the opening. It was on the cover of the Architect magazine, which is the main magazine for architects in the US at the time when Trump was pushing for his Muslim ban. The mosque itself was built by different craftsmen from different religions, so it attests to the fact that architecture is inherently an ecumenical project. I don't know if I have time, but I will show quickly a research that we've been doing since 2016 also. It's called City of Islams, and it portrays on a single map 14 years of mosque architecture. So you have from the days of the Prophet till contemporary times, and when you put them on the same map, I'll show quickly, kind of zoom in. This is Qarawiyyin, the oldest university in the world. A couple of examples from for the Uyghurs in China, for a mosque in Tehran. So we kind of map them all in their context. So what was interesting for us, if we look at these all together, it shows us, I mean, it showed us four things in hindsight. The idea that as religion moved towards contemporary times, you can notice the scale of the mosque started very small and then became opulent and more grandiose. The context, since we drew the context also, the mosque was much more integrated in its context versus becoming more the mosques that we've seen for the kind of a state mosque. What they're called, state mosque. The third thing is, again, programmatically, how the mosque was much more integrated, going back to the idea of the jamia, versus now they're much bigger, but they're only liturgical and programmatically. And the fourth and more important things, once we set the north, kind of related them all to the north on top of the map, you notice that a mosque that would be, for example, located in the US is facing Mecca while in one direction, while the mosque facing Russia would be in the other direction. So inherently and architecturally, the quality of the light negates the idea of one architecture for Islam. So it's much more pluralistic than what we're led to believe. We took this research to Oslo in 2016 and then in Turkey in 2017, I think. And I think that's it. I'm going to move quickly. I want to finish just by a couple of sentences. The idea that I think, I mean, the importance of architecture is that it through its abstraction and through its program, it can really transcend what the specificity of the religion can be. And I think the message that we are trying to portray architecturally is both addressed to the West that perceives Islam and all the subdivisions of Islam as a monolith, versus an Orient that also perceives the subdivisions as a threat. So I think this idea of intersecting and overlapping identities is a richness that should be preserved. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking, I think, excursion through various spaces. And I'd like to thank all three of our presenters, Dr. Hood, Dr. Najjar, and Dr. Al-Qadi. Thank you very much.
I'm not a doctor, so.
I insist. I insist.
Sheikh.
The floor is open for questions.
Kindly stand up
address
and
them to the topics that were discussed.
Yes.
And address them to the speakers. Thank you.
Nizar Ghanem. My question is to Dr. Michael Najjar. In the past 2 days, I've been hearing a lot of actually American Druze speak a lot about Tawheed. And so in your argument, you're saying that the West has misrepresented the Druze, but your representation of Druze is always about Tawheed. Rather than that the Druze are not just about Tawheed, because, and this, if anything, I would argue, it shows that the American Druze society, by losing the materiality of the community, that is what is left of the representation. So my question to you would be, aren't you actually misrepresenting, in a way, the Druze, or representing it from your own perspective? Especially that for as we know, for Tawheed, the importance of the materiality of the community, the Jama'a, is what matters.
Yeah,
thank you.
No, I agree with you in the sense that the two examples I gave, one was took place with Mashaykh specifically in the play, The Return of the Druzes. So in my opinion, they would be the representatives of Tawheed specifically. And then in the contemporary film, for instance, The Syrian Bride, the communal values that define the Druze as a social group actually are the ones that I think are more important than even the Tawheed itself. When I look at Tawheed, I look at it as a life philosophy rather than a religion in the dogmatic sense. And so the idea of how we deal with one another, how our relations are with one another as muwahhidun, as Bani Ma'ruf, those are the things that I felt are sometimes misrepresented. And frankly, even if there were representations of people who broke away from the Tawheed, or broke away from the Druze as a social concept, would be interesting films as well. But again, those aren't being presented either. So we're really left with a very strict, dogmatic look at these hardline mashayikh who are basically dominating the Druze people without understanding even the social ties and mores that hold us together as muwahhidun. That's really my focus. So, shukran.
Sorry, just a quick note of clarification. We'll take 2, 3 questions, then we'll address them. Then the speakers will address them rather than one at a time, right? Yeah.
And then Raymond, and then we conclude.
All right.
لارا الحلبي. بدي أحكي عن المؤتمر بحد ذاته. أنا كنت حابة بمواجهة كتم أو إخفاء تاريخ مهم، حقبة مهمة من تاريخ الدروز اللي هي 800 سنة، حقبة حكم الأمراء التنوخيون للبنان. 800 سنة ما صار فيها ولا أي خلاف ديني بين المسيحيين ولا الدروز، ومع إنه بيسلطوا الأضواء بيخفوا هيدي بالعتمة. حتى كان في، وحتى الامير عبد الله التنوخي وزع اراضي على الدروز وعلى المسيحيين، في كتب بتقول هالشيء. هلا اذا كنا بدنا نضوي بهالمؤتمر اللي هو 1000 سنه من تاريخ الدروز، نعم هال 800 سنه من اصل ال1000 سنه وينن؟ وكنا بنحب نشوف مثل ما ركزنا على شكيب ارسلان نضوي، وعلى نجله ابو عز الدين، كمان نضوي على وجه مضيء اللي هو كمال جنبلاط اللي علم كمان بالجامعه. 800 سنة.
Anyone who is interested in writing about any of the topics you talked about has to submit. We never tell people what to talk about. We never, this is...
Yes, you had a question. Yes.
Okay.
Hi, finally. Yes, your question.
No, I know it's nice. I know it's okay. أنا اسمي لولا حمدان.
مرحبا.
I was born in America and I was mainly raised in Canada. هلا أنا قاعدة باللبنان. صار لي 14 عام. Thank you. مايكل، أنا بس بدي أسألك سؤال. مثلا أنا بس كنت عبلش. أنا I studied acting in New York City. I was there for 4 years. I worked with a bunch of actors from New York. أغلبهم إسلام. So أنا, it was very hard for me to find any kind of support. إنه عم بيحكوا عن فلسطين وإنه أشياء هيك. إنه أنا I couldn't ما حسيت إنه part of the Arab community. Okay. So it was very difficult as an actor to even find content. Especially in نحن the Druze were a little conservative about some things. So for me it was very difficult to even find content, things to relate to. So after the 4 years خلاص أنا كان عندي شغل بكندا مع أهلاتي and I dropped Oh, I'm sorry, Arabic or English? Stick to one? Okay. Oh, those Canadian Americans. Okay, sorry. Here's my point.
Sure.
I know we need more creative people in our community. But when we're growing up and we have our social gatherings, like our Druze gatherings in Edmonton, for example, I was told that no one would marry me because I was an actress.
So please, do you have a direct question we can address to the panel, please?
So my question for you is this. How does somebody who really loves their culture integrate into the scene as an artist without coming across as being pretty much a sharmuta?
Right.
Sorry.
No,
al kelme. But
no, and I'm
to the point.
Yeah. No, and listen,
Wait.
Well, let me.
One more question.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
She will be asking the question on behalf of someone who's watching us and sent us a question over WhatsApp.
Sure.
Actually, we have friends and family in the United States live streaming this. And my daughter has a question. And this is really directed at Dr. Najjar. And the question is, Allah yarhamu, Dr. Jack Shaheen had dedicated the last 3 decades of his life and even more on correcting the false ideologies and perceptions portrayed intentionally in American media. And when I say intentionally, I'm talking in film production and media in general. The question is, and based on what you shared with us earlier, do you believe there is a lack of archives about the Druze? 1 or 2, falsification in Western preservation of Druze history, or 3, simply ignorance.
So, should I? Okay. To your point, and this gets back to my larger point, which is, it's not fair that we keep our children out of the arts because of many reasons, maybe economic, but also because of the perception of the way that they will be treated, so to speak, and viewed. I find that to be wholly unfair and cruel, frankly. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as Druze to use our aql and think widely about the fact that we've been artists. The Druze have contributed to the arts for thousands of years, if depending on your view of how long we've been around. So why can't we allow our children to continue in that artistic tradition without treating them as something lesser? And that's because it really is not fair, especially our women. We have some of the most talented, the most beautiful, and the most intelligent women in our community, and it's not fair for them to be, in my opinion, shut out from this field. And if I ever do that to my daughter Malak, come back and hit me, yallah. And secondly, as far as Dr. Shaheen, Allah yarhamu, he was somebody very dear in my life. He helped me, as a matter of fact, in my own career. And I want to say that looking back at the 3 points you brought up, the lack of archives, yes, there's a lack of archival work. I've tried to dig up information even on Khalil Gibran and Amin Rihani and Mikhail Naimi, who are all playwrights, by the way, and very few people even know they wrote plays. So we need to do a lot more work in our own historiography as Arabs and as Arab Americans, and also as Druze, to find these things that are part of our history and to uncover them. I call it personal archaeology, frankly. Secondly, falsification is rampant, and especially, I don't know how many of you spend time in North America, but you say, I'm Druze, they'll say, Druid? You say, no. Jewish? No. Druze, what's that? They have no concept whatsoever, so we've got to educate. And so I teach classes, for instance, in Arab American theater, where I actually have my students, I give them a list of different people in the Middle East, Druze, Chaldeans, Assyrians. What's that? Isn't it intentional? And I would get back to the third, which is about the ignorance. And I would say, but in some circles, it is intentional. But interestingly enough, with the Druze, I'll meet 2 different types of people who might be in the film industry. The one would say, the Druze, you are our best fighters. We love you. We send you to the front lines, So there's a respect for us on some level. But there's also the idea that, we Druze, in many ways have, I think, an outlook on the Arab world that is diverse, and we can see both sides of many conflicts. If you look at how we see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as Druze from Palestine versus the Druze from Lebanon and Syria, I think that we're kind of the perfect Arab translators for what's going on in the world, because we're caught in many difficult and diverse situations. So yes, there is ignorance, yes, there is a lack of archival information, and yes, there are some people who are willingly trying to demonize Arabs, period. All Arabs, they're willingly demonizing them in the arts and in film. But that's why we have to work even harder to fight against the negative representations with our own representations, or else we will continue to be demonized or forgotten in the arts and the film.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. Thank you for the chair. Thank you for the panelists. We will be taking a 5-minute break before we come back to our 9th and final panel, which will be concluded. Then we will move to the exhibit next to West Hall to open the exhibit of Zain al-Khalil and Hala Shair.
الو الو.
رح اعمل ورح ابعث لكم.
لا نحن بنعمل.
لا انا رح اعمل ورح ابعث لكم لانه وصيت عليهم.
ثانك يو.
تحطيها؟ انا انتبه انا حطيت لك ابولوجي ستيتمنت اليوم اكثر ما كنت حكيت.
هلا لما نحكي انا احطك
Kindly take your seats. We are starting. We're just waiting for Dean Sheikh to arrive. Kindly take your seats. We're going to start immediately. Kindly take your seats. Kindly take your seats.
Okay. أنا هلا بس I don't hear myself. I like when I hear myself.
إذا بتعملوا معروف ما نبلش. يلا.
Good evening. I'm thrilled Okay. Good evening. I'm thrilled to have you all here. We want to thank once again the organizers of this wonderful meeting, Professor Abdelrahim Abu Hussein and Dr. Makram Rabah, for all the work that they have done to ensure the success of this once-in-a-lifetime event. We want to thank also the team that has supported them, Rita and all the others who have been supportive. So this is the last panel of the day, and it's a very special panel. We have 3 panelists, and they're going to be almost in conversation with each other. Rania will give an overview of the panel and connect the conversation here with the visual addendum at the Biblos Gallery that will follow immediately this panel, which is entitled Women, Diversity, and Disruption. The 2 artists, and they're immediately to my right and left, Hala Sher and Zena Khalil, will share with us their artistic journeys, their stories, and anything they can fit in the very short time they have. Rania will follow up maybe with 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll open up the floor to the public. I will try to briefly just introduce the panelists. I will maybe start with Rania, who is teaching in our department in anthropology here at AUB. She is a graduate of AUB economics, BA, and then a master's in anthropology as well. Received her PhD relatively recently in art history and world studies. Actually, she completed it in 2017. And the thesis was titled Art in Translation and Diaspora, the work of 3 Lebanese women artists. The artists, we have to my left, Zain Al-Khalil, who is an artist, author, cultural activist, and Nada yoga instructor based in Beirut. She has exhibited in a number of very important places, and is, has a particular way, a particular process in which, what's the word? Which she performs her way of being, a painter and an artist. Hala Selwa Rauda Shair is a pioneer of, So Hala is the daughter of Selwa Rauda Shair, and I would like actually, and she has, she's living in New York now and is exhibiting her art in New York. She is visiting for this conference, has a master's degree from the Sorbonne in cinematographic studies, and has been painting for a long time in her life. Her most recent solo exhibition was held at Agial Gallery in 2017. So both of them will share their artistic journeys with us, and I will give now the floor to...
Thank you. Thank you, dear Nadia. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you to everyone for being here. And of course, thank you to the panelists. As dear Nadia said, I'll give an overview of the theme we're looking at today, and this will be followed by the presentations, and then we'll look at the exhibition, which opens right after the panel. Hala and Zena unknowingly lived in opposite buildings at different times in an area of Beirut. Hence, they inhabited parallel spaces that foreshadowed the conversation that will start today with the opening of their intervention in AUB's permanent collection. They met for the first time this year to collaborate on the show Women, Diversity, and Disruption, which opens today. The show is composed of 2 parallel lines, which you'll see behind me, lines that never meet. They cut through the main entrance hall of the gallery, offering a conversation by the 2 artists who face each other once again on opposite lines. The line is a crucial metaphor for this intervention. It signals several ideas, a continuation as well as a disruption, since the lines do not have a beginning nor an ending. The line could also refer to a subjective path or to lineage in terms of descent and inheritance. The notion of disruption becomes clear when considered in terms of lineage by highlighting matrilineal descent, which potentially offers an overt critique against historical traditions of a patrilineal form of descent. By highlighting the transmission of heritage through women's narratives, experiences, voices, and artworks. In fact, both artists claim allegiance to potential matriarchal figures in their families, women who have greatly influenced them as well as their work. Both artists also reference female figures, evoking ideas of the female body without representing the body. For instance, Zeina relies solely on process in her work. For instance, the journey from the concept of the artwork to its realization. And oftentimes she uses her own body to paint and to engage with places that have endured violence. This element of performance in her work includes her donning attire that is usually worn by Druze women. She often burns symbolic garments and retains the ashes which she transforms into paint for her canvases. While Hala, who prefers to focus on the result of her artistic journey rather than the process itself, works with lines, objects, and details, and states that the resultant canvases at times invoke a process of healing. You will see in the gallery the transformation of countless seeds that she has collected and recreated to serve a different function, hence interrupting the flow of the object's nature. In fact, the material used by both artists in the show is largely connected to the land. For Zeina, it is places that have endured violence, while for Hala, certain seeds, such as pine seeds and pine needles, evoke reflections of childhood memories and the capacity for exploration and play, hence offering the potential for recreation and destruction, both paradoxical elements that are informed and evoked by their artworks. In this panel, we present a conversation exploring how two contemporary artists work with notions of lineage and language. Through our discussion over the last month, or a bit more, like 2 to 3 months, we've questioned possible influences in artistic processes and in artworks. The focus on heritage, which keeps coming up, allows us to recognize women's voices and recognize the power of transmission. Just as theorists have addressed the notion of post-memory, which are memories that are inherited by different generations, as being crucial to understanding cultural identity, I'm also inspired to think of narratives, stories, beliefs that can also be inherited. According to the UNESCO report on intangible heritage, which includes things like language, taste, can be inherited, codes of ethics, behavioral patterns, beliefs, etc. Women are central to the maintenance and vitality of cultural heritage and diversity worldwide. Their roles in relation to intangible heritage are of particular significance and encompass what may be described as fundamental domains and expressions of cultural heritage, which are very often central to maintaining cultural identity. Hence, the focus on transmission or intergenerational transmission is key to maintaining and passing on intangible culture to future generations. Women, in fact, recreate and transform culture, and this is an avenue that still requires a lot of research and exploration. We've been engaging in a dialogue about these connections, if any, between one's cultural background and heritage and the process undertaken in the creation of artworks. How does one's background influence subject matter and process? We still do not have an answer, but what we do have is an exploration and an ongoing conversation. In fact, the dialogue has proven to be unending, which reveals a need to create a platform to discuss issues about what the past signifies and how women artists contribute to a present and future dialogue about heritage. Of course, I am aware that contemporary artists have much more in common with other artists than they do with artists of a similar cultural background. So rather than reduce the discussion to essentializing ideas or beginning with a fixed idea of what Druze heritage is, we're interested in thinking about, or we acknowledge the complexity of the discourse, and rather than thinking of it as of heritage as something that is fixed, I believe that the intervention that you will see today demonstrates that heritage is actually constantly changing. The underlying concepts of disruption and diversity in the intervention not only alters how one looks at art objects and heritage, but also questions the language used to talk about art in terms of permanence and impermanence, or the temporary, the fleeting, versus the fixed and the transcendent. The reason why I'm using this language is, I mean, exhibitions are often quite temporary. They last for 1 to 2, 3 months. But what is happening in the exhibition that Zena and Hala have created is that they're intervening in a permanent collection, so AUB's permanent collection of artworks, and they're presenting something that is quite temporary, because it's on for 2 weeks only. So we're working with ideas of what is fixed and what is temporary, what is permanent, and there are interesting references to language as well. The work that Zena will be presenting in this intervention recontextualizes the word rahma, mercy, and evokes the word's etymology and symbolic connections to the female body and potential for matrilineage. So finally, thinking about the exhibition, in addressing diversity, we are greeted with the 2 parallel lines that I began with, of 2 women, signifying works by 2 women of Druze descent. I think what unites the 2 artists is a state of impermanence concerning heritage, and the need to question one's heritage, as well as long-established art historical canons, collections, and archives, and to create a dialogue across generations and different media by highlighting a matrilineal heritage that has been invisible and potentially sidelined. Through the parallel lines, both artists insert a matrilineal voice, hence the line becomes a form of language, as a means to connect thoughts, ideas, and places. The line demonstrates a subjective journey which serves a purpose, but also reconsiders heritage as matrilineal, as performative, and as constantly changing. So, would you like to, Zena, would you like, Hala, would you like to present?
Yeah, I just read you my story, and the slides will show my work parallel to that. Okay. So I'm here today to share with you my experience, both as an artist and as a woman. I was born in Beirut in 1957 to Yusuf Shukair from the village of Arsoun and Salwa Rauda from Ras Beirut. Both my parents were in their 40s when I arrived at the Khalidi Hospital on Sidan Street, 2 blocks away from here, becoming their only child. My mother was a pioneer abstract artist and my father a government civil servant. We lived in the Rauda family building on that same street with my grandmother, my uncle, my aunt, and my cousins. That setting for an only child was like heaven. It provided me with the sibling that my father had long refused to have, in addition to the joy of growing up with the aroma of my grandmother's kitchen. The doors of our apartments were always open, so I would head straight to that kitchen after school. There, I always find some leftovers waiting for me in the mesh cupboard, namliye, or hidden baked goods in tin boxes. Although my mother was always around, her time was mostly spent in her studio on the upper floor, working on her art. This idyllic setting was sprinkled by my mother's activities and creativity. I was allowed to draw on the walls of our apartment, and my pencil marks remained there to my embarrassment for many years. Just like my mother, I was always doing something with my hands. I painted the cover of my baby album when I was a toddler and won a prize for clay sculptures when I was 7. As a teenager, I had the walls of my room plastered with photos of movie stars, but since they did not mean much to me, I took the liberty of transforming their faces into all kinds of collages. Then the Civil War broke out in 1975 and everything changed. Traumatized by the killing of a relative, my mom made me leave for Paris on a very short notice, catching the last flights
before the airport was forced to shut down. I was 19 years old. I had barely settled there when I read in the newspaper that our village had been shelled and sacked. My grandmother was able to flee, but was never able to return to her home. Next to those experiences, I was trying to understand the mysteries of the universe and our complex minds, and trying to figure out my identity, what it meant to be a Druze and an Arab woman. My thesis at the Sorbonne, focusing on a Japanese film, made me explore Far East art and religion, as well as many other spiritual subjects. My search to unveil the secrets multiplied my interest, shaped my character, and changed the way I eat and breathe. I started drawing in ink with very fine ballpoint pens, women with endless details, occupying desolate spaces. After graduation and following immense pressure from my parents, I returned to Lebanon, where I tried to manage on my own. I had few jobs, but never stopped painting, despite the shelling, the snipers, and the car bombs. As the war intensified, in 1987, I left Lebanon again, this time to the United States, where I settled in Washington, D.C. There, I was able to sell a considerable amount of paintings. On my first visit to New York, I was fortunate enough to meet a very fine gentleman who happened to be from a village 5 minutes away from mine. We got married a year later, and we still live in New York, parents to 2 lovely daughters. As a mother living in a foreign city without any family support, raising my kids was a full-time job. However, I was able to insert my art into games I prepared for them. Then I joined the Art Student League of New York, where I started spending more hours there as their school days grew longer. In the meantime, my parents on the other side of the Atlantic suffered tremendously from years of endless war. They aged quickly and needed me. After my father passed away, my mother could not continue working an art book she had started. So my visits to Lebanon became more frequent to help with the book, and I was torn, stretched between 2 continents. The book was finally published. Mother would spend endless hours examining its pages and admiring her lifelong creations, all included in one consolidated volume. I later curated a retrospective for her work, and she came to see it on a wheelchair. That was the last time she left home before passing away. Then I decided that I should pursue my life as an artist. I ended up simplifying my material, using 1 color and 1 brush on a small paper. And this is how it all started, exactly at the end. The title of my first show of these works on paper was Grains of Light. The small repetitive movement allows me to enter a personal, intimate space to capture this fleeting moment. How light catches dust. I wanted to share memories I encoded in place and time. My long, thin brush is full of paint. It rests on the white paper. I breathe in continuous circles. The flow forms the deep well. My brush grows empty. The tool and the hand inform the mind, and the mind follows. I also like to think about the notion of time and the mechanism of perception, the temporal illusions of our brain. If I'm showing time, does it matter how much time I take? I am collecting memories, freezing time on a piece of paper. It is time I give. In my last exhibition, titled You Promised Me Spring, I showed colors on large canvas. It is nature and its intricacies. It is the happiness of a moment when we look deeply into a grain of sand, when we discover that inside a pine shell, there is a nut covered by a thin layer, when we look inside the core of an artichoke, when we hear the sound between 2 sounds. In conclusion, my memory often takes me back to that old house on Sidani Street with its green shutters. The sun is seeping through the glass of the dining room window, and my mother is all smiles, pouring olive oil over my plate. This is the only color that matters. This is the warm light that I keep looking for.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to jump in with my story now. Okay. So wonderful to be here. By the way, this is truly a historic event. Thank you, AUB. Thank you, Makram. Thank you, Dean Nadia, especially for making this panel and exhibition possible. Very grateful to you. Thank you. So, space without the dark could not hold the stars. Carving these words in Arabic into slate, I came to learn that pain could become the greatest teacher for compassion, and that art can be a tool for transformation and change. Thank you. With all my work, I ask the question, through the expression of pain and its transmutation into absolute love, is it possible to create an object that could put an end to violence? I spent the first 15 years of my life in Lagos, Nigeria, and in 1994, I chose to move to Beirut. I was 18 years old, right here at AUB. The civil war had just ended, and I lived alone on a rooftop studio in Ain Mreisi. I could have gone anywhere in the world, but nothing at the time seemed more important than participating in the rebirth of this country. Migrating between these two lands, I received exposure to violence, racism, poverty, and of course, war. Africa gifted me with a connection to Mother Earth and Father Sky. And from the Middle East, I learned about the beauty of impermanence. I received my education from fruit sellers on dirt roads in Apapa, as well as books I voraciously read from the Librairie Internationale here in Ras Beirut. When the Twin Towers came crashing down in New York City, I was standing right in front of them. And in 2006, I kept a war blog under the bombs in Beirut. I've known all my life that I wanted to be an artist, but it was my upbringing rooted in compassion and empathy with others that drew me into activism and then eventually healing. So, I've been conducting healing ceremonies in places that endured violence and trauma, such as the notorious former concentration camp, Khiam prison in South Lebanon, built during the Israeli occupation. I've worked in abandoned homes in Suq al-Gharib, destroyed by the USS New Jersey in the 1980s, and Ramlet al-Baida, the stretch of beach in Beirut that suffered from the spillage of 15,000 tons of oil into our sea during the 2006 July war. Well, all this work started from a very personal place. The first site I worked on healing was my family home in Hasbaya, South Lebanon. Our home was once occupied by the Israeli army, and for over 20 years was used as a military detention center where people were imprisoned, interrogated, and even tortured. In the year 2000, when South Lebanon was liberated, I went home for the first time and took photos, not really knowing what to do with it all back then. It took me 15 years to process what happened, and after a sort of descent of grace, or Shaktipata in Sanskrit, I started developing these ceremonies with spiritual teachings informed by yogis and shamans I'd been traveling around the world studying with. Well, because Druze sacred knowledge is not accessible to anyone see the Druze flag anywhere? Okay. Well, reversed colors. I'm not making any assumptions here. I'm just sharing my findings. So, it's also through the ceremonies and ritual that I actually create my paintings, sculptures, videos, and sound works. The ceremonies include a process of meditation, music and chanting of mantras, dancing and whirling, and a purifying fire ritual. From the residual carbon ashes of the fire, I create a special ink on site, and then I begin to paint. During the ritual, I work on emptying myself in order to become a hollow reed or an empty vessel, in order to tell the true story of the space. By being fully present in these locations, by bearing witness, I believe we can develop a visual language that comprehends what perhaps might be so fundamentally innate in us, our tendency towards violence, as well as our capacity to love. There's also a deeper incentive to working in these spaces of violence. I catalog and document historical atrocities. The country I have inherited is one that lacks a coherent history. History post-1975 is not taught in our public schools, and instead, world-class nightclubs have been built on top of sites where massacres happened. In a final act, I paint the mantras that I chant in Arabic onto small canvases and leave them permanently fixed in these spaces. They read love, mawadda, compassion or mercy, rahma, forgiveness, ghufran, and peace, salam. Salam, salam. During my daily meditation, I repeat these words in order to continue sending healing to locations even after I've left. The word is the audible manifestation of breath. And all the while, from silence to breath to sound, there is vibration, or spanda in Sanskrit, the subtle creative pulse of the universe as it manifests into living form. And it's words that have powerful healing vibrations that I choose to work with. If the entire cosmos and all that exists, from the smallest quark to the largest quasar, consists of sound vibration, nada, then we could use sound energy, even our very thoughts, or spandan, thought vibration, as building blocks to create a global matrix of peace and reconciliation. Inspired by nada yoga, union through sound, and dhikr, repetition of devotional phrases, I use words in a creative play of consciousness into form, and form awakening into consciousness. My sculptural mantras become perfect units in a complex arabesque, multiplying and expanding through anahata, unstruck sound, and pranava, audible sound, creating a bridge between universal consciousness and the physical world in an interrelationship between vibration and form within the matrix of space-time being. In 2007, I created a 40-day multidisciplinary national-scale exhibition entitled Sacred Catastrophe, Healing Lebanon. I chose to exhibit in Beit Beirut, a former block of apartments, once the most beautiful in Beirut, that during the civil war was taken over by militiamen and turned into a sniper's nest. From here, hundreds of people were shot dead. The intention was to transform this once killing machine into a community platform for healing and reconciliation. The exhibition included paintings, sculptures, photography, video, and sound art that I had made during the ceremonies. I also created a large-scale installation entitled Forgiveness times 17,000, which serves as a remembrance to the 17,000 people still declared missing from our civil war, as well as a reference to the former Green Line and the lush vegetation that once grew through it once Beirut was split into two. The same line Beit Beirut is located on, one wooden green line for one person still declared missing. I also led a daily peace ceremony and curated 40 days of workshops and lectures, everything from introduction to yoga classes to academic panel discussions. In a country where fine arts is still relatively new, this part was critical in terms of developing community engagement. It also helped the viewers develop a toolbox for their own personal self-healing. The exhibition attracted close to 10,000 viewers, perhaps a first in Lebanese history. The success of this project goes to show that through art, it is possible to bring communities together to heal. During the exhibition, a man came up to me and shared with me that he was a child soldier during the war, and that this was the first time he had set foot in Beit Beirut since fighting there in 1978. I was truly overwhelmed and wasn't sure what to say, so I just stayed quiet. Then he came up to me and said, thank you. And he pointed to one of my sculptures, which was a ceramic work composed of 108 tiles with the word ghufran, forgiveness, imprinted on it. I learned then that when trying to heal a community, we must address all sides, even the man behind the gun, especially the man behind the gun. And so again, the question, is it possible to create an object that could put an end to violence? After years of work and research, asking all sorts of people from gurus in the Himalayas to quantum physicists at TED, I found my answer. It is possible. You are that object. You are the greatest work of art ever created. You can work on yourself on a personal level to become that instrument of peace, because peace starts from within. And if we can tune ourselves back to the resonance of universal love, which I have come to learn is our true essence, our true essence, love, then everything falls into place. We are that object, art is the tool, and love is the way, connecting us all to everything there ever was and ever will be, every atom, every leaf, every whale, every star, every breath, come together to create this beautiful fabric that is this, us, here, now, love, love, love.
Thank you very much, Zana and Hala, for sharing such compelling personal stories and journeys. I thought it would be interesting to think about the importance of having an exhibition that is about disruption and all the different kinds of disruption that that we have the potential to create, or you have the potential to create. There is a lot of, both of your works focus a lot on repetition and recreation. Whether Hala you're working with seeds, or thinking about birthing and rebirthing and recreating. Also, Zaina, when you're working with words, like the word rahma, which is recreated in the exhibition. Why, and healing comes up as well in your work. Healing it's been a kind of something that we've talked about quite a lot. Why is there a need to create some kind of artworks that represent healing? And why is healing important for heritage as well? And could we think about perhaps the need to connect disruption with the need for healing? Is there a connection? Or if you wanted just to say, I think it would be interesting to talk about how you address healing in your work. And I know for Zena, it's the process of your work. Maybe you want to talk about that a bit more and why it's important. But for Hala, it's, I think the end.
I'm working the whole time on something that I feel I'm stitching, and it is a process of healing. And I don't know, we mentioned a little bit today the mandil and how I feel a little bit like it goes in a way of healing. And I thought of my grandmother, that she was a very important figure in nurturing. And this is a woman heritage that we carry with us. So now we are the grandmothers for the future. So I don't know what kind of healing we're gonna give to our other generation, you know. So, I mean, we're thinking. I mean, this is a process. We're thinking about everything we use and why we use it and the inspiration. So this is also, it's still in the process. So continue.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think it's really interesting that you're both interested in healing. I know of Zena, it's very much connected to place. And for you, Hala, it's about memory. Yes. But it's interesting that you're making this connection between and inheriting these memories that symbolize healing for you. And this is something you're recreating. So you have that agency or that power to recreate a form of heritage as well.
Yes. Yeah, but I would like to believe that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you believe, Zena, what about you and your kind of approach to healing, beyond kind of looking at compassion and love?
So before working on healing the spaces I live in, there was the need to heal the space within. And to use your word, disruption, I think that the first phase of being an artist was about disrupting my entire education that I had received. And I'm not just talking about school, I'm talking about life and culture and environment. And I had to disrupt my relationship with my identity as being Druze. Because there was it was a source of anxiety not having access to knowledge and information. And growing up in Africa, I also had the lack of language. I still, and so there was the need to disrupt first my identity as Druze. And so the very first works that I started creating, the things that I was burning, and please, this is completely subjective and no offense to my sisters in the audience, but I had to work with the mendil. And because the road I was taking with the spiritual development was about leaving the material world and really moving towards the subtle. And the mendil was a form, and it was a form that I felt created a block between me and the source. And so I had to burn it. And again, please, no offense, this is my personal journey as an artist. But in Eastern religions and philosophies, we call the material world illusion, Maya. And there is the tendency to try to burn through Maya, to get to truth, to get to the ultimate truth and source. So the very first pieces that I made were used by burning the mendil, and that was my primary disruption.
We will open up the floor for some comments or questions that you may have to the panelists.
Any relationship between yoga and Tawheed?
Let's take one more. Can you stand up, identify yourself?
Did you ask a question? Did they answer the question? You asked the question. Okay. Zena, Latifi Nakade, you said something like healing the physical place, but first you have to heal yourself. Healing the physical place, as I said, and as I have learned before in the spiritual field, is that whenever something happens in a place, like a bad omen, a death, or war, whatever, it infects the walls and the electrical wires. And then do you think that you are healing the place to take this bad omen?
One more question by Dr. Akarli.
I remember, first of all, thank you very much. It was an elating and informing presentation all along. But I'm asking that there is also another need of dialogue here, artistic or otherwise. There are no men, but violence comes from men mostly. I remember Lebanese novelists, artists emphasizing this theme, how violence in the Civil War very much was a men behavior, whereas women wanted settlement. There is some kind of tension there between disruptors and those who look for Ra'an and also see a connection to Ra'im here. How do you establish a dialogue with us?
Thank you for your question about yoga and Tawheed. I cannot claim to be an expert, so in the context of this panel, I can only give you a subjective opinion of my experience is that there is quite a lot in common. And I know there was a lady here who voiced her concern for Kamal Jumblat earlier, and we all know that he spent a lot of time in India. So let's take it on his account that there may be some connections and correlations between the two. And to answer your question about what you called bad omens, I don't believe there's such thing as bad or good because I have a non-dualistic connection to the world and source. Love and pain are two sides of the same coin, as is good and evil. But what I do believe in is the power of your personal journey and experience in the world here. And I cannot claim anything, but I can be fully responsible for myself and my life. And so by saying that I work on healing these spaces, I don't think at the end of the day it's something that's scientifically quantable. Is that a word? But thank you. Quantifiable, thank you. But perhaps it's more of a symbolic gesture, and it's an exercise on self. I mean, the mantras that I repeat every day, connecting back into these spaces, ultimately it's my exercise, and which I cannot impose on anyone or a space or a location. I hope this answers the question.
May I? Okay, so this is Sarah Abu Diab. First, thank you so much for all the inspiring and really very touching narratives and stories. I just want to give a parallel and different narrative of the mandil. So I had my mandil as a 12 years old, and I believe I made some kind of disruption, but the disruption I made as a woman and as a Druze is wearing it all the way to AUB, to Nepal, Italy, and now on my way to being a physicist. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that story, Sarah. I just want to say, I think we have this idea in common that when we talk about disruption, it's to move away from stereotypes. So I think, you broke a stereotype, and that's exactly it. It is a disruption. And earlier we saw the presentation on the intellectual, Najla, who we don't know much about. And this is another form of contemporary disruption. And just to kind of build this information database, discourse. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Sorry, Hani Hassan from the AUB, teach both philosophy and civilization studies. I want to thank you both, and of course Rani as well, for this really, if I may echo, elating discussion and journeying. And one of the things I think that stuck with me, both looking at the minimalism, if I may say, at some level, Hal, I'm not sure, the interplay between single color, single shape, piece of paper, and the emptying, right? The making void, a beginning of the journey. One of the things that occurred to me is in relation to art as a creative impulse. We normally feel that the negative or the lack of humanity, or the lack of empathy, the lacking, what is lost is actually a lot of the times the root of the problem. Whereas I think from both of your approaches, process, pre-process, post-process, I think what's being proposed is that, on the contrary, the negative is the beginning of the constructive rather than the destructive. So how would you reconcile this approach of saying, on the one hand, it's when we lose our humanity, lose our empathy, that we become destructive men, and how do you reconcile that with more now the move that says, on the contrary, go to the seed, go to the detail, dwell with the detail for a while as long as possible, and even better, dwell with the void as long as possible, and that becomes generative. Is there a way to reconcile these two possible opposites? The question is for both of you, please. Thanks.
I don't know. I mean, I don't give too much thought. It's such an intimate journey that it's very difficult for me to intellectualize what you've been saying, which is, thank you. No, thank you. Thank you. But I take it very, it is a very intimate and personal journey. So I don't know how to go further, actually. I don't know. I mean, I mean, you simplify things and then you create with them. This is how I feel. So I don't know how to.
I would definitely echo Hala in that it is quite intimate process. And I would like to add that silence came before sound, came before creation, and God said, "Let there be light," etc. Silence is where the answers are. And you were talking earlier, asking about reconciliation. And I think that if we could practice the art of sitting in silence, we can learn to listen better. And when we can learn to practice empathetic listening, there is no conflict. Silence.
I'd like to thank the panelists, and I would like to invite you all to join us at the Biblos Gallery, which is basically part 2 of this panel. So I hope many of you can join us to the actual exhibit of the works of Hala and Zena. Thank you very much.
اهلا وسهلا فيكم. رح ننتقل هلا لحد الويست هول لنفتتح المعرض بعد 5 دقائق. اهلا وسهلا فيكم. خلينا نتفضل للويست هول.